The Israelites set out and camped in the plains of Moab across the Jordan from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw that all Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was in great dread of the people because they were so numerous. Moab was overcome with fear of people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian,
"This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field."
Now Balak, son of Zippor, was king of Moab at that time. He sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor at Pethor, which is on the Euphrates, in the land of Ammon, to summon him, saying,
"A people has come out of Egypt. They have spread over the face of the earth, and they have said, 'Come now, curse this people for me, since they are stronger than I. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that whomever you bless is blessed, and whomever you curse is cursed.'"
So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the feast for divination in their hand. And they came to Balaam and gave him Balak's message. Balaam said to them,
"Stay here tonight, and I will bring back word to you, just as the Lord speaks to me."
So the officials of Moab stayed with Balaam. God came to Balaam and said,
"Who are these men with you?"
Balaam said to God,
King Balak, son of Zippor of Moab, has sent me this message. A people has come out of Egypt and has spread over the face of the earth. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to fight against them and drive them out.
God said to Balaam,
"You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed."
So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the officials of Balak,
Go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you.
So the officials of Moab rose and went to Balak and said,
"Balaam refuses to come with us."
Once again, Balak sent officials, more numerous and more distinguished than these. They came to Balaam and said to him,
Thus says Balak, son of Zippor,
"Do not let anything hinder you from coming to me, for I will surely do you great honor, and whatever you say to me, I will do. Come, curse this people for me."
But Balaam replied to the servants of Balak,
Although Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord my God to do less or more. You remain here as the others did, so that I may learn what more the Lord may say to me.
That night God came to Balaam and said to them,
"If the men have come to summon you, get up and go with them, but do only what I tell you to do."
So Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the officials of Moab. God's anger was kindled because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as his adversary. Now he was riding on the donkey, and his two servants were with him. The donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. So the donkey turned off the road and went into the field. And Balaam struck the donkey to turn it back onto the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on either side. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it scraped against the wall and scraped Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck it again. Then the angel of the Lord went ahead and stood in a narrow place, where there was no way to turn either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and it said to Balaam,
"What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?"
Balaam said to the donkey,
Because you have made a fool of me, I wish I had a sword in my hand. I would kill you right now.
But the donkey said to Balaam,
"Am I not your donkey which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I been in the habit of treating you this way?"
And Balaam said,
No.
Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road, with his drawn sword in hand, and he bowed down, falling on his face. The angel of the Lord said to him,
Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? I have come out of the adversary because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. And for me, surely just now, I would have killed you and let it live.
Then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord,
I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now therefore, if it is displeasing to you, I will return home.
The angel of the Lord said to Balaam,
Go with the men. Speak only what I tell you to speak.
So Balaam went on with the officials of Balak. When Balak heard that Balaam had come, he went out to meet them at Ir Moab, on the boundary formed by the Arnon, at the farthest point of the boundary. Balak said to Balaam,
Did I not summon you? Why did you not come to me? Am I not able to honor you?
Balaam said to Balak,
I've come to you now, but do I have power to say just anything? The word God put in my mouth, that is what I must say.
Then Balaam went with Balak, and they came to Kiriath Huzoth. Balak sacrificed oxen and sheep and sent them to Balaam and to the officials who were with him. The end.
Well, I'm going to do two things I never do. One, I'm going to take off my shoes because my feet hurt. I think I hurt myself when I was on vacation, too much running around with grandkids. And the other is preach from a pulpit. I've never done this before, but I think because of the mics and stuff today, it's just easier for us to do it from here. So can you all hear me? That's my question. Oh, good. So we're going to be talking about this crazy story. And, we're in this series. We're in the second of a series called, Stories They Didn't Teach You in Sunday School. I'm curious, before today, how many of you remember just even vaguely the story about Balaam? Now, some of you have been reading the Old Testament with me for the last year, so you might remember this from Numbers. But you know what? Most of us just sort of write it off, right? It's kind of a little crazy story. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, I've sort of treated it that way too. When we were reading through the Old Testament, a group of us this last year for OT20, we came to this story and there's some kind of crazy inconsistencies here, like maybe you caught it. At one point, God says to Balaam, this crazy prophet, go with the men. And then in the next verse, it says God was angry with him for going, right? And I remember Susie Ryan, of all people, she always picks up these inconsistencies. Susie is the best at this. She said, why is that? And in the class, I went, probably there was a sentence missing or something. I kind of blew it off. You ever do that? You have a story in the Bible and you kind of go, I don't get it. I'll find some other explanation later. Well, I kind of felt bad because after all, I am the pastor and I'm supposed to know everything, right? You're supposed to laugh at that. So anyway, my curiosity got the best of me and I thought, I need to do some more research on this. And it was really interesting because while we may not talk much about this story of Balaam, the Bible talks about it a lot. Did you know that Balaam is quoted, the story of Balaam is referred to 3 times in Scripture? 3 times in the New Testament. It's actually quoted more often than that in the Old. So in the book of 2 Peter, one of the disciples, Jude, another one of the early disciples, and John in the book of Revelation all make reference to Balaam. In fact, he must be so well known that they don't have to describe this very long story. They just say these false prophets, and it's usually referring to false prophets, were just acting in the way of Balaam. And they assume that everybody in their audience knows exactly what they're talking about. So maybe we should know a little bit more about this story too. What are they talking about? Also in the prophetic literature of Nehemiah and Micah, same thing. These passing references to Balaam, and it's never complimentary. And so we're going to explore a little bit about this story that most of us are unaware of or maybe have forgotten or tried to not really think about too much. I mean, after all, a donkey talking? Yeah, I think they had it right when they said that sounds like a Shrek movie, right? Why does it matter and what's its relevance to us? So let's just pull back really far. Let's go back and look at it from the 10,000 foot level. And that would be to say, what is the book of Numbers all about? And you'll remember, Genesis, say it with me, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? These are the first 5 books of the Bible. This is the Pentateuch. And so this is the kind of the core law that the Jewish faith is based on. And of course, that's the foundation of our faith as Christians. And so Numbers, what we say in English, is really kind of a poor name because when you start reading it at first, there's a few sentences in here, you think, I don't want to read that book, it's boring. But there actually are a whole lot of stories because in Hebrew, the word doesn't mean numbers. The title given to it means in the wilderness. And so what this is a story of is of the people of God, the Israelites, after they've been rescued out of slavery in Egypt, are now in the wilderness. And this is a story all about that in-between space between that dramatic rescue with the Moses with his stick and all the plagues and Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea, and now they find themselves in the wilderness. This book starts off with reminders of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. They've just been into this middle ground called the land of Paran, and now they're in the Moabite territory, and they're just poised to cross the Jordan River and go into the promised land. But the thing about the book of Numbers is it's a book about rebellion. From start to finish, God is trying to mold this ancient Israelite people into a people that will center their lives on God. In fact, when he puts the camp together and he says, where all of you should camp, all the families are sort of camping out here, there, and everywhere, he pulls them all together, and right in the middle, he puts the place of worship, because worship of God should be central. And when they become a mobile community and they're wandering around and going from place to place, he orders them according to priority given to those who lead in worship, and the people are meant to follow. And then when they set up camp again, who's right in the middle of their lives? All the symbols of God's provision and power and God's presence are there for them. And God wants this unique group of people to be a people who is known for being faithful to God. But the challenge is they're anything but faithful. They are just as squirrely as we are, folks. So they're out in the wilderness, and God's, traveling by the fires and by clouds and all this sense of God's presence. And every day there's this miraculous stuff on the ground that they gather up called manna. God's provision is amazing. Are they happy? No, they grumble. It's not enough, it doesn't taste good, it's boring, it's bland, it's blah, 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 blah. So then God sends some quail coming, and they just disobey at every single turn. In fact, they are so obsessed sort of with their own livelihood or their own sense of being able to provide for themselves, that instead of looking forward with hope to what this future world might bring, God, after all, promised them a land where they can be free, where they can serve God wholeheartedly. Their eyes aren't looking forward, their eyes are stuck in the past. In the middle of Numbers, there's a big rebellion that happens, and they say, take us back to the flesh pots of Egypt. We'd rather be in Egypt and be enslaved than be out here in the wilderness with God. Pretty powerful, right? But then they decide they really don't like who God's appointed, and so they rebel against Moses. They just at every turn, and God finally gets so fed up with them that God says, you people, even though you've seen some of the most dramatic displays of my power, despite the fact that you have experienced miracle after miracle, you are such a grumbling people. Your hearts and minds are so turned away from me that you, this generation, who's experienced all this, isn't going to get to go to the promised land. Your children will, but you won't. You have too much of your life in the past, in your old way of thinking. You can't seem to break out of this new way that I want you to be and how I want to relate to you, that you don't get to come in. And so what could have been like a 2 or 3 week journey, maybe even a 40-day journey, as the Bible talks about, uses the word, it's a 40-year journey. In other words, it's a whole generation that have to die. And in fact, in all of this, Moses isn't any better. Moses gets booted from the entry into the promised land as well. So there's just rebellion all over the place, unfaithfulness, untrusting. And so the story of Numbers is all about that. And then we get to this chapter. And suddenly the whole story shifts focus. You'll notice the Israelites are a part of the context here, but they're not involved in the story at all. And yet it's another story of God's trying to express God's faithfulness to God's people, and another story of rebellion. But this time it's like, see, even those who haven't seen my miracles, even those who haven't oriented their lives, you can't just say, well, maybe they would be a better people to follow me. They get it just as wrong as the ancient Israelites. So what happens in this story is that the ancient Israelites in Numbers have been moving around the land. And as they move around the land, they're a big group of people. There are hundreds of thousands of them, so the story goes. And when they come into an area or a territory, Moses usually sends an emissary out ahead of time and says, hey, if you let us pass through your land safely, we will be kind to you. We won't make war with you. We're just on our way to our end point. And the countries and the tribes that actually let them pass peacefully, that happens. But most of the tribes don't believe them, and they strike them and they rise up against them with violence. The Israelite people rise up against them, and God gives them victory in every single case. So it's not surprising that the king of Moab is a little concerned when he hears that they're camping out on his front doorstep. What does this mean for me? What does it mean for my people? And he has a responsibility, doesn't he? He has a responsibility to keep his people safe. And so he develops a plan. And his plan is, I'm going to call this prophet I've heard about. The prophet doesn't live in his neighborhood. In fact, he lives pretty far away, hundreds of miles away. But he's heard about this prophet Balaam, and he says, maybe Balaam can figure this out. He says, I know. I'm going to offer Balaam a bucket load of money. And then I'm going to get Balaam, this man who's supposed to be a divine, sort of has the direct link to the divine. I'm going to make him curse these people. Now, for those of us who have been involved in modern day politics, we know that rhetoric doesn't necessarily become reality. You can say all you want about your enemy, but that doesn't mean it's going to come true. But in this day and age, it was different. And they really believe that if someone who is an appointed person of God, any of the gods, discerned and then pronounced a curse, that curse would come true. Same thing as if they pronounced a blessing would come true. You know, our closest thing might be a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing. You know, if you believe it enough, it'll probably come true. If you think something horrible about yourself, horrible things will probably happen to you. But in this day and age, that wasn't the way they saw it. It really was sort of like your words mattered. And if you made this curse, if the king Balak could get Balaam to curse the Israelites, because Balaam is a prophet who speaks on behalf of the divine, then those people would be cursed. So what Balak is really trying to do here is he's trying to force God into his plan. How many times have we done that? Have we tried to force God to adhere to our will rather than yielding? You know, it's interesting, Balak doesn't explore any other option in this whole story. He doesn't say, let me go to Balaam, who's this diviner, and he's not an Israelite prophet by any description. He doesn't say, let me go to the prophet and seek God's will in all of this. Let me see what he might say would be wisdom here. Instead, he's got an idea in his head of how to solve this problem of these Israelites, and he stops at nothing to make it happen. If we know, the story goes on in Numbers, and it says that after Balaam has this experience with the donkey, he actually meets up with Balak, as we heard a little bit. But then the story goes on, and the king's basically saying, hey, I gave you all this money. I sent my whole entourage with you, and you are insisting on blessing the Israelites. And Balaam says, hey, I can only say what God told me to say. So then Balak says, well, we'll see about that. So then Balak takes Balaam up to even a higher mountain, a place of like where God and the divine are supposed to have like a holy place, a thin place. And he does it again. He does it 3 separate times, trying to force Balaam to speak the words of God that Balak wants to hear, that the Israelites should be cursed. Balak's sin is that he will stop at nothing to try to bend God to his will. I don't know about you, but I have stories of that in my own life where I've cried out to God and I've raised my fist and I said, God, if you would only arrange the whole circumstances in this particular way, I am sure it would be much better for the whole universe. It would certainly be better for me. Have we ever had those moments in our lives where we're so angry, so insistent, so afraid, so I'll shut down that we can't see any other option? And the nature of our prayer is to insist that God solve the problem on our terms, that God do our bidding, that God seek, and that if if God only knew, if God only thought from my perspective, I'm sure my solution is the best. And you know what? I have empathy for King Balak. He had responsibilities. He had a perspective. He was actually trying to save his people. But in his fear and in his narrow-mindedness, he could only see one solution, and he tried to jam it through. And he tried to use a representative of God to do it on his behalf. How many times has the church been inscripted into the evil of this world? As many of you know, I love the Middle East, and it's a part of my heart, but when you go there and you see the infighting of these three Abrahamic religions, you can see how each group has tried to leverage their scriptures, their understandings of God against the other as a weapon. And if it wasn't for about religious reasons, how many times here in this country have the church justified things such as slavery, white supremacy, homophobia? All sorts of things have happened when we try to take the religious, divine things of God and try to bend them to our will. And most of the time when we do that because we're afraid. Or we have certain responsibilities and we don't like the potential of the outcome. And so we do everything we can to force God into our box, instead of seeking the wisdom of God. And maybe for those of us when we're facing crises, that's the first stage in a whole stage of responses that we may have. When we are afraid, when we have responsibilities, we often cry out and make demands of God. Like Balak, we don't seek the wisdom of God. We just issue our ultimatum and try to make it work. We try to force it into a box that will work for us. But what about Balaam? You see, Balaam's the more subtle one here, because Balaam actually does say the right things. You remember that when the entourage comes to him and they demand that Balaam issue this curse towards the Israelites, Balaam says, I can only say what God says to me. He goes, he seeks God's will, says, I can only do what God says, I can't do any more. But then we get to that moment of that inconsistency, where Balaam seeks God's will and God says, if the men come to you in the morning and ask you to go with, in other words, they've had the conversation the night before, if they still insist on you going with them, then go with them. But there's no conversation the next morning. In other words, Balaam can say the right things, but his attitude is that he wanted to do what he wanted to do. And so in that place of not really obeying God, sort of like what we have just seen, if you were reading in Numbers, what happened with Moses. Moses just manipulated God's words just slightly and doesn't do exactly what God says. But we can take that narrative all the way back to the early stories of the Bible in Genesis, can't we? It's when we add something on or we take something away, we don't want to truly do what God says or be the people who God calls us to be. We're just going to sort of do it. We're going to put on the face, we're going to put on the Sunday dress, we're going to put on the false facade, and we're going to say that we love God or we follow God or we obey God or we're faithful to God or we're about the things that God loves. But there's something in our hearts that is still ordered towards ourselves. And we see this in Balaam. Balaam, who is a person who makes his livelihood from being sensitive to the Spirit, cannot see a powerful manifestation of God in this angel that blocks his way. You see, Balaam had stopped seeking God's will or God's Spirit, didn't want to be in God's presence. Balaam was just going on his way and possibly hoping to reap a very big reward. Like Balak, he possibly thinks he can convince God. Maybe if he argues with God on another night or another day, maybe things will turn out okay towards his end. And remember, we have stories like that. Moses, who is also a prophet of God, one who is sensitive to divine things, actually engages God and argues with God. And God does change God's mind. But Balaam's heart isn't really turned towards listening to God, being in God's presence. It simply turned inward towards himself. No matter what the facade is, how many times have we in our lives said the right things, written the right cards, looked up the right scriptures, tried to be about presenting that false front, but inside there's just something that isn't attuned to the very presence of God. I have a dear friend, I spoke with her this weekend. Last November, she started feeling kind of lousy. When she went to the doctor, it was complicated because of COVID. They basically patted her on the head and told her to go on her merry way, but things weren't right. This was a woman who's been a runner, an athlete, and yet several years ago, she'd had heart surgery and had valves in her heart replaced. She kept saying, I don't feel good. Something's wrong. But she said, I trust the doctors. I'll do my thing. I'm just gonna. They say I'm okay. I'm okay. And of course, given COVID, the ability to navigate these appointments with doctors were very, very difficult. She lives in California, where everything was shut down. But she told me I tried in the middle of the night. She said I would cry out to God, and I would be, God, come on. I need to be well. I want to be up to myself. I mean, I don't like feeling this way. You know, God, whatever's going on, just heal me. Like, make it go away. I just don't want to feel this way anymore. She started off in that same sort of way. I want to bend my will. I want to bend God to my will. I want to be okay. Just whatever is passing, let it go. But she's a person who actually seeks the presence of God, and so she backed off of that prayer and said, okay, God, just help me listen. I don't know what to do. Nobody seems to think there's something wrong. And she said she woke up after dreaming one night and knew she needed to call her cardiologist, which she did. He didn't believe her either, that something was wrong. But after she kept insisting, that still small voice of God in her heart, she insisted and said, you know what, I just come in? She did. Turns out that over a series of several weeks, like 6-8 weeks, she was diagnosed with severe infection within her body. In fact, now to this day, she'll be on antibiotics the rest of her life. She was hospitalized for overall combination. She'd been in and out. She became in and out of the hospital. They thought they were going to do surgery. And all she kept saying to me as I would talk to her is, I'm just praying that God would be present to me. She said, of course, I want you to pray that I'll be well, but I'm more concerned that just this day I can wake up and be grateful for the day that I have the strength to do what I need to do, and that God will be with me. You see, she went through that whole process of trying to bend God to her will. Then she moved into a time of, she actually said all the right words, and then somewhere in the middle, she had a really breakdown moment and said, I don't even know where God is in all of this. And then she began to trust God at that deep, deep level. She said to me yesterday, it was her first day back at work. She missed 3 months of work. She has an IV drip hooked up to her, which she takes with her everywhere. She's now required to wear a helmet, even when she goes and her beloved activity is sailing out on San Francisco Bay, because the medications she has, if she bumps her head, she will bruise in such a way that it could be life-threatening. And yet yesterday, as we were talking, she said, I'm just so grateful. I'm just so grateful. She goes, I got to wake up today and I'm alive. And I have joy. I have a wonderful family. I have a job. God is present with me. And I said, Lena, you know, most people wouldn't feel this way after everything you've been through. She goes, yeah. She goes, I'm not even sure I knew how serious it was until I realized that once I was out of the hospital, the doctors kept calling me every day at home just to see how I was. She goes, it was only at the end when they said to me, we think you're going to make it. She said, what do you mean? You thought I wasn't for a while? And they go, yeah. We weren't really sure. You see, Balaam reminds us that we can try to bend God to our will, but it's not going to work. In the end, God is God. We can put on the false front, and inside, God will find a way to break through whatever it is to speak to us in a way that can be transforming. But the piece of this that's important for us to remember is that Balaam goes on in the next 4 or 5 chapters, and he eventually leads the people of Israel to terrible behaviors. You see, just because God speaks to us once or meets us one time, we have to make the continual decision to put God in the center of our lives. That for every crisis we have, every challenge that we meet, we have to keep turning back to God. We need to remember how God met us in the past. But instead of grumbling, we need to use that as the fuel and the foundation of moving forward into the future, a future with hope. That's the nature of the Balaam story. When Scripture tells us to be warned by Balaam, it says, don't try to do it on your own terms. Don't put up that false front. But instead, seek me again and again. Just like when I ordered the whole camp around God at the center. Keep coming back. Keep returning. And the adventure and the possibilities are endless. Amen.